what led to her being handcuffed?
Well, police say that they got a call about a woman with a gun, so of course they came down to the scene, they detained her, but as we saw, while the woman was face down on the ground with her hands behind her back, at some point she raised her head, and the male officer in that video that we see, he appears to kick her with his foot. Now that officer, as you mentioned a couple of times, was a sergeant. He was placed on unpaid suspension, and another officer who was at the scene that we see there was placed on administrative assignment, and this really kind of triggering a lot of people who say this really was a mental health issue and that this was dealt in so many ways and on so many levels in the wrong way.
Yeah, and perhaps the last, but the harshest was that kick.
Yes.
You know, no matter what they were dealing with or who they were dealing with or why, that kick, handcuffed on the ground there. So what happens next for these officers?
Well, the Atlanta Police Department's Office of Professional Standards, they're going to investigate, and in a statement they said the actions of the sergeant, quote unquote, appear to be unacceptable. Of course, we all know that certainly it wasn't acceptable. Now, they're also concerned with the apparent lack of reaction from the other officer who was at the scene, because as we know, Sharon, if you're an officer and you do nothing, you are just as guilty. And I think one of the things that's most interesting about this too is this was, as we've seen in many situations, in plain daylight. I mean, in the headlines, we see so much, obviously, that people have cameras, but it doesn't seem to shake police officers at all, knowing that they possibly could be rolled on, that somebody is recording them in some way, and that obviously always it is a viral incident when something like this happens.
Yeah, and the office, I think you called it professional standards. I mean, quite frankly, Candace, I mean, couldn't they take an all-day lunch break after seeing that? I mean, it's really not that difficult. Right. I want to know why we're talking about relieved of duty and professional standards when I'm not an attorney, but I saw an assault. I saw an assault that's criminal, I would think.
Yeah, and like you said, it's obvious what happened, but then of course there's due process involved, and we've seen this before in other situations where officers, they claim they don't get the due process, they're not heard, right? And that's part of what's guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. And so they want to make sure that they cross all their T's, give them their due process. And my guess is that this will end up more than a suspension with these particular officers, because as we said, this was a sergeant who knew better, but obviously just didn't do better. He's been on the force for years, and so has the young woman in the picture too. They had to have known better, definitely, but they just couldn't find themselves to do anything else other than what we saw.
Yeah, it tells you everything as she's standing there, what appears to be, looked like her arms were in front of her, just kind of down, as she watched and did nothing. And we don't know if that other officer saw anything because he just kind of walked by a little bit later after the kick. But I mean, to me, there's your blue wall right there. Okay, nobody intervenes even now. Due process, I'm worried about her due process, the woman on the ground. But there is this other story out of Atlanta, the suspect in the spa shootings last March that horrified the country, destroyed so many families, struck a plea deal. Give us the details of that.
So in this plea deal, Robert Aaron Long, he pled guilty to all of the charges in the first 4 shooting deaths, well, at the age of 22. For that, he was handed 4 consecutive life sentences, plus 35 years, Sharon, without any possibility of parole. So those are the details of the deal. Not a good deal, especially considering what he's going to face down the line, right? Yeah,
and you know, first question that comes to mind, you killed all those people. What about death penalty? And
he's going to be facing it,
you know,
because, you know, next he'll go to Fulton County. This was someone who he shot people in one county, moved on to the next county. In the next county, he's going to face domestic terrorism charges. But this time, prosecutors want to classify the killings as hate crimes. Now, this may be a little difficult to prove because the shooter said he was not motivated by hatred. If you recall, he said he wanted to punish the people who enabled his sex acts. Now, this is something that he said as soon as he was arrested, and then it was repeated by police. And even the FBI agent at the time said that it didn't appear to be racially motivated. So we have this trial already happening in the public discourse. So next month, he's going to face those charges, and what's called a hate crime and sentence enhancement will also be a part of this process. And as I said, the death penalty is on the table. And looking at it, we just see how prosecutors in 2 very different counties can look at the same case and come out with a very different result. So it's very important that we know who our prosecutors are, who our DAs are in this process, because we see the charges that they can and cannot put to a suspect.
Yeah, we're going to see what happens. We'll be watching this one very, very closely here. Were you surprised or that there was a deal struck here, a plea agreement, or do you just see it as this was an expedient way to get to the next chapter?
I think that they're trying to go through the steps. I think that this is an expedient way to get to the next chapter, and there was no way around him not being found guilty of these charges. This was someone who, once he was caught, he had the gun in his hands, right? He was bleeding. He was at the scene. So there's no way we can't connect the dots to him. But it will be very interesting to see how this next one plays out, because the Asian community is certainly upset that this has not been looked at without any racially motivations in terms of his intent behind it, because it does seem like that's what it is, and certainly a prosecutor in Fulton County believes so too.